because they will go and they will talk to their GP or their psychologist or both or whatever, and they talk about how busy their minds are. And so we automatically assume it's an anxiety-based problem rather than an ADHD problem.
Hi, I'm Jo Clark, and thanks so much for joining me today. This is the Redefining Midlife podcast, a podcast designed for the 40-plus woman who is determined to challenge society's myths and beliefs around midlife. It's for the woman who is inspired and ready to define midlife her way. Join me each week as I chat to health and wellness experts for up-to-date information on how to live well as some special conversations with incredible everyday women redefining what midlife can look like. Here's to making our next half of life even better than the first.
Hello and welcome to episode 114 of the podcast. This episode marks the start of a fascinating 3-episode series into neurodivergence and why there is an increase of women in midlife being identified with conditions such as ADHD. Now, today I'm welcoming back guest expert Kirsten Bouse, who also featured in episodes 67 and 83 of the podcast. Kirsten is a clinical psychologist who specialises in working with midlife women. And in this episode, she's going to help us understand more about ADHD and how it presents differently in girls and women, and then why there's an increase of women being diagnosed with ADHD during perimenopause. And as you'll hear, not only does Kirsten have vast clinical experience, she also shares her own lived experience as a late diagnosed ADHDer. There's so much great information and real-life examples that Kirsten gives in this episode. Remember, if you think that this information could help someone else, please share the episode with them. And now, without further ado, let's welcome back Kirsten to the podcast.
A big welcome back to the Redefining Midlife podcast, Kirsten.
Thank you. It's so cool to be here. I love chatting to you, and certainly when I get to chat about the things that I love to chat about. So that's awesome.
Excellent. So today, because we're going to be talking about ADHD and how it affects women in midlife and beyond. And we're all very lucky to have you here because not only are you going to give us some of the clinical experience and understandings of what ADHD is, so we've all got that common understanding. You're also coming in with a lived experience as a midlife with ADHD. And we know that it's a topic that's only really being talked about more openly now.
Yeah.
So everyone who's listening is going to come in with that different level of understanding and go, well, I'm hearing a lot about it, but what does it really mean? Or everyone's talking about it. It's an overused term. So let's start with, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about what ADHD actually is and what are some of the most common symptoms?
Yeah, sure. So I guess ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a lot of us in the profession that work in the space, and certainly those of us who have that kind of diagnosis, we're not really great fans of the language around it and the name for two reasons, I think, because we actually don't so much have a deficit in attention. We can be very, very attentive. And in fact, there's a phrase called hyper-focused if we're super interested in something. The challenge for us is regulating it and directing it where it needs to be, when it needs to be, and for the length of time it needs to be. That's in terms of our attention. So that's the trick for us. And, we're trying to move to phrases such as neurodevelopmental conditions. And that's simply because I think in the world that, my wish maybe one day is that it's not even something to diagnose, because that we just recognize the diversity in how brains are wired and how they work. Disorder implies it's a problem, it's a deficit. And I guess, I don't know if you've heard of the social model of disability rather than medical model of disability. So with the social model of disability, we're really kind of just talking about different abilities that cause problems for the person. It causes the person to feel disabled because the world's not set up for them. And, from a perspective of ADHD, the world is really set up for people whose brains are perhaps what we would refer to as neurotypical. And therefore, the difference in how our brain works becomes problematic because it doesn't fit well in that system and that social structure and the expectations that come with it. So some people would definitely identify as an ADHD, and they'd see it as a disability because it does, it does create that conflict or that challenge, because it's just the world's not set up for us. And other people may not identify with the term disability at all. It doesn't feel like a disability, but it still might feel like a challenge. So yeah, that's the term. There's 3 different types. And there's the hyperactivity impulsive type, then there's the inattentive type, and then there's the combined type. And the combined type is both the hyperactivity, impulsivity, and the inattention. In my family system with my 3 sons, we have kind of all versions of it, really. Well, we don't have anyone who solely has the hyperactivity impulsive type. So one of my sons has a diagnosis of inattentive type, and myself and my other 2 sons have combined type. And so, there is that kind of spectrum that we've got now. So when we're looking at ADHD and the current requirements for diagnosis, we do actually need to find evidence of the challenges from, under the age of 12. Certainly that's part of the diagnosis right through to adulthood and in a number of life domains. That's really quite critical. There is some conversation that maybe things like perimenopause and the hormonal shifts that occur may trigger it, so it may not be able to be evidenced in childhood. But that is certainly not, I guess, robust research to confirm that there's some validity to that. It's more thinking and speculation. Because what often happens for females is ADHD symptoms show up at our hormonally vulnerable times: puberty, pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's talk about some of the symptoms then, Kirsten. What would you be looking for as a practitioner, or what might someone who could be listening will go, oh, yeah, I identify with that, that, and that. So what are those things that in particular?
Yeah. So in particular, the struggles that we have are in our executive functioning, in that they kind of work differently to other people's. And so when it comes to executive functioning, we're really talking about things like our capacity to plan, organise, initiate, monitor our behaviour, monitor our engagement with the task, attend, as I said, in an appropriate way to the things that we need to attend to. Motivation is a big thing, but that ties into initiation. Working memory is often a challenge for ADHDers, and it's not part of the diagnostic criteria, but and I know there's more research going into this area because of it, because a common experience is what they call rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So it's that really kind of heightened and intense response, which some people will describe as it being physical pain in response to, overt, blunt and mean criticism, but also feedback can be given with good intent, but experienced as extremely painful. And emotion dysregulation is part of it as well. So ADHDers tend to feel very deeply, all the feelings. So, that's kind of a broader perspective. Some of the stuff that, when I'm thinking of the screening tools, that often they're readily available. So they're not diagnostic by any means, but they're screening tools that people can answer. There'll be things like that relate to time blindness, so punctuality being a difficult thing, and getting lost in things for hours and not recognising that time's passed, being so absorbed that you don't notice that you're thirsty, you're hungry, maybe not even really notice that you need to go to the loo, things like that. A bomb could drop. You're so absorbed in the task, and that's where the hyper-focus and the high attention is. Then the typical stuff is, losing phones, losing keys, losing stuff in general, forgetting appointments, clashing, being in two, realising that you've set yourself up to be in 2 places at the same time. That's a common one for me. I call it dot joining. I'm not so good at dot joining. I actually don't tend to forget appointments, and I'll remember them both. but it's only when I'm starting to organize myself to go to one that it's like, or either of them, it's like, oh my God, I can't be in these two places at the same time, or I haven't allowed enough time between them. So yeah, these are some of the common struggles that happen as well. And then, the hyperactivity and the impulsivity. Let me talk about that. So the image that I used to have of an ADHDer is a boy going off his chops at home or in the classroom, maybe even to a point where they're aggressive, but certainly just unable to sit still, rocking on chairs, getting up, standing up, poking people, talking, interrupting, being very, very, very physical in the presentation and doing impulsive, crazy things that you just go, oh my God, didn't you think that through? Well, no, because it's impulsive. That's often the picture that we have. And as one of the criteria or some of the criteria around impulsivity and hyperactivity, you've got to meet that. And so if you when we had the benchmarks of that kind of picture, a lot of females, girls and women wouldn't meet that. For us, typically our hyperactivity can be internal, as in very, very busy minds. And this is where a lot of women with ADHD have prior diagnoses of anxiety, because they will go and they will talk to their GP or their psychologist or both or whatever, and they talk about how busy their minds are. And so we automatically assume it's an anxiety-based problem rather than an ADHD problem. Now, those two things can coexist. And in fact, the comorbidity for ADHD and things like depression and anxiety is quite high, as it is for addiction, substance problems and stuff like that as well, for lots of different reasons. But yeah, essentially, the hyperactivity can show up as an internal thing. If it's a physical thing, women tend to do it more subtly. So they're not necessary, or like one of the questions on the screening tool, whether you're a child or an adult, is something like, I get up out of my chair all the time when I'm not supposed to, or something to that effect. Well,
I've just got these images of the classroom, so I'm going, oh, God, I can remember that.
Yeah, you remember that, right?
Yeah.
But as time passes, and females in particular are very acutely aware of the social environment and the expectations. And so this is where masking comes in. So we learn that that's not okay to do, and we can learn it quite young. And so the hyperactivity might show up in nail biting, skin picking, hair twirling, crossing your legs and jiggling one leg. I was told for years on and off by clients, gosh, you move a lot in your chair. And I would just say, yeah, I can't seem to be comfortable. And that's all I put it down to, because I didn't know I was an ADHDer. And so these aren't so disruptive. Do you know what I mean? They're just things that we might do. Some people, though, will say that that they can't sit through a movie, or they can't even sit through, kind of a half-hour TV show, because they just can't sit still. So you'll find that they're always doing other things you're smiling, always doing other things. So the hyperactivity can come in there. It can also come in verbally, as can the impulsivity. So things like chatting incessantly, school reports, talks a lot, that kind of phrase. So you can get people who are very, very chatty, and the impulsivity can be the experience. And, I have this myself at times, foot in mouth. So women who often say, God, I put my foot in my mouth all the time. It's often because, the impulsivity comes out in what they're saying. They might interrupt people, blurt things out that are kind of a bit out of context, or sometimes inappropriate. There can be a sense of, if I don't say it right now, I'm going to forget it, which is true, because the working memory is not so great. So there's that urgency of, I need to say this. And with the hyperactive mind as well, that can be very tangential. So it's not that you're ruminating on the same thought again and again and again and again, which is often more what anxiety shows up as. But a lot of ADHD women in particular will say that, yes, they've got a busy mind and it's covering lots of different things. And so, again, that can then be expressed verbally, where you're kind of jumping from that to that to that to that to that. And I just thought that's how women communicate, isn't it? Like, we can have 6 different conversations going on at the same time. And things, but that might be because I've got a lot of ADHD around me. because birds of a feather.
Well, that's right.
So
That's something to be very mindful of as well, isn't
it
it?
is. It is,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then the inattentive is also quite common in females because that's the daydreaming kind of thing. She's not paying attention. She's not really listening. She seems away with the fairies during class or during meetings. Because I do have a house full of ADHDers, we're all quite known to say things like, can you repeat the last bit of that? Because we've tuned out. We heard the first bit, but we tuned out to the second. And instructions as well. What that means is, you hear the first bunch of instructions, or maybe you just pay attention to the last bit, but, you're not able to, you're not attending to the full set of instructions. So the inattentiveness, often shows up with that. Somebody introduces you and you kind of, it introduces themselves to you. And so they've said their name, hi, I'm so-and-so. And there's a part of you that's kind of, it acknowledges that. Yeah, hi, I'm such and such. But you actually haven't really been paying attention to then store that name in your memory to then have any capacity to retrieve it. So, these are a lot of things. And I think, before we jumped on the podcast, we were having a chat. And if you say this to anyone, a lot of people will say, yeah, I lose my keys and I forget people's names. And, I find it hard to organize stuff. And I'm a procrastinator too, and all the rest. And somebody once gave me a really kind of great understanding of how to respond to that. And that response is, well, we all need the toilet X amount of times a day. But when we're needing it 20, 30, 40 times a day, it's extremely disruptive, and it's indicative of, something that's a challenge and an issue.
What a great way of highlighting that. Yeah, we can all identify with, like, I'm crappy with remembering people's names, or I have trouble remembering a whole, like, verbally a list of various things. I'm more of a visual learner rather than auditory learner. But I'm not. It's also a cluster, isn't it, of various things. And it's just interesting. I can say, yep, but no, not that. No, not that. No, not that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
With somebody who's listening, Kirsten, and listening to what you're saying, going, oh my God, I seem to be most
all of those things,
of those, or if not all.
Yeah.
They're then more likely that would be a signal to perhaps investigate further. Yeah, perhaps you could be neurodivergent. There could be that your brain is just working slightly different to, inverted commas, the mainstream, what we call a mainstream brain, the average.
Yeah. I mean, to get a diagnosis of ADHD, if you're going through any formal process, as I said, this stuff has to be evidenced kind of in childhood. You need to be able to think back and give examples, as well as more recent stuff. And, you also, it has to impair your life. It has to make life difficult. And the interesting thing is, I think for late diagnosed and the midlife and perimenopause, menopause kind of overlap is that, your listeners are probably similarly aged. So we're all sitting in the midlife, which means our schooling and education was in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And, ADHD, like most other health things, particularly mental health and neurodevelopmental, the criteria is based on boys, first and foremost. And so that's a really critical thing, because like many other health issues, we know the signs of heart attack for women are different from men, but we only know that because suddenly somebody thought, wow, why more women die from heart attacks than men do. And people started to investigate, because the signs are different. We've got a long way to go with this stuff for sure, more broadly. And certainly in terms of ADHD, the criteria is very boy-based. We know now how it can show up in women. And so while the criteria remains the same, we've got a broader way of looking at each of the criteria. So hyperactivity, as an example, doesn't have to be jumping on chairs, jumping out of chairs. That we know that hyperactivity can show up in more subtle ways physically, but we also know it can show up in the cognitive kind of room thinking stuff. That wasn't known back when we were in school. And so that's one of the reasons it wouldn't have been picked up. But I think the challenge with a diagnosis now, which if people are interested in, I would certainly encourage, if that's what they want to do, go ahead and do it. But the challenge we have is it can be difficult to think back and look back and find that evidence. one of the things that I guess I learned through my process of both being assessed, diagnosed, rejecting that diagnosis for about a year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but not because of the stigma. I just couldn't. I couldn't see it. I just couldn't see it enough. I went and got assessed and diagnosed because one by one, all three of my boys did.
Gotcha.
And my eldest has a different dad to the second two as well. So I'm the common thread. There's a strong genetic component to it. And there were things that I started to kind of, I guess, recognize when I was filling out forms for them as mum, that I was like, oh, okay, yeah. But yeah, I did reject it because I'm like, how could I have achieved what I achieved and have ADHD? And again, that's a very narrow, stereotypical, old-fashioned perspective of ADHD. And I can kind of come back to the ADHD achievement thing a bit later because I think it's relevant. But, for me, I knew who I was. I knew the things I was challenged by. What I didn't have is the ADHD lens explanation of it. So I just thought, well, this is who I am. This is my personality. This is, life experiences have shaped me this way, birth order or whatever, all of those things. I mean, being a psych, we tend to try and make sense of ourselves and how we've arrived at who we are. And those were the explanations that I kind of attributed that to. But one of the things that I guess was the clincher for me in accepting my diagnosis was when I really looked back on my career. And I think that was, really apparent to me. So, I'm coming up to 50, as I said to you. I've been a psych for about 27 years. And I took a very different career path to most other young women who became psychologists. And quite vastly different. And by that, I mean, I got contracts and did lots of different work. I didn't go into public service and get a nice, sensible, reliable, secure job and stay there for a long period of time. I didn't do that. I took pathways where my income wasn't guaranteed, where, and there was that instability and flexibility in work hours, because I just somehow intuitively knew I couldn't do 8 till 5, Monday to Friday in the same building with the same people. I just couldn't do that. It was going to bore me to tears, probably suffocate me. And I actually remember at the time when I was married saying to my then husband, quite upset because, I guess having a self-employed career is tricky at times.
Yeah.
I remember crying and saying to him, I wish I could be the public servant psych that I know you'd love me to be. He's a police officer, so lots of job security there, but I just can't, and I don't know why. It's just how I am. So I'd had a sense of being different from my colleagues, same age colleagues from the day dot. For all of those kinds of reasons. And my career, the only reason I've been able to be a psych for this long is because I've pivoted multiple times in my area of interest. After a period of time, I need a new challenge. And it's not so much that I'm really obvious that I'm bored, because people are fascinating to me. It's more that I get a hankering to learn something new. And then I thought, hang on a minute, how did I do my TE, my year 12 exams? And because I was kind of a conscientious girl, but I just shifted paper around on the desk because I wouldn't have had a clue how to study. I really wouldn't have. Everything was done at the last minute because my thoughts came together at the last minute. I couldn't think clearly until I had urgency or interest or both. And that is the ADHD brain. That's probably the biggest difference between an ADHD brain and a neurotypical brain. Neurotypical can mobilize their motivation and their capacity to organize their thinking and anything else they need to organize, like plan how they're going to do it and implement it. They can do that when something's just simply important.
Gotcha.
For us, you may as well stab us in the eyes. Importance is not enough. It's got to be interesting and or urgent. And then those things come together. And that's related to dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter of motivation, and it has a big impact on attention. And that's where, I mean, there's still a little bit of query as to, do we not have enough? No, we don't have as much dopamine, or we don't kind of release it as easily. It doesn't kind of get mobilized. We don't use it as effectively. And I also know there's another kind of conversation around that we actually use it up too quickly, which is why our attention wanes, because, it kind of, we use it up quicker than what the task maybe requires of us. But dopamine is a really big kind of part of this conversation. And the reason it's relevant to midlife is because dopamine functions best when we've got lots of estrogen.
That was my next question I was going to ask you. So, let's talk about the role that hormones can play within a woman's life anyway when we're going through menopausal transition. So you talked about dopamine then, and you just mentioned that the role that dopamine plays and the interplay with estrogen. So can you just talk us through that? And that's why midlife women might suddenly realize that, it's coming to the forefront now.
And in my very, being a psychologist, not a psychiatrist or a medical doctor, I've got a really basic understanding, but that probably suits most people. And that understanding is that, I talk about dopamine and estrogen being friends, and dopamine's able to kind of do its thing best when it's got its friend alongside, which is estrogen. And we know that this interplay is important for a couple of reasons. One is because the challenges of ADHD show up, in puberty and pregnancy, postpartum, and perimenopause, because that's when our estrogen is kind of fluctuating. So we have big spikes, or yes, overall perimenopause we're declining, but we still have quite big spikes of estrogen. And pregnancy, our estrogen's going up and up and up. So for some women who know their ADHD, sometimes pregnancy is a time when they're least challenged by it. But with the postpartum, when there's that massive estrogen crash, that's when the challenges can emerge. And again, you often attribute it to, well, of course I'm having problems. I've just had a baby and I'm learning what to do. And, it's all very unpredictable. All very, very, very true. But it can have that added layer for ADHD women of being even more challenging because of this dopamine estrogen interplay. So that's definitely, one of the key factors that informs us. But then if we look at the menstrual cycle in and of itself, we also know that a lot of women will experience heightened challenge, ADHD challenges in the luteal phase, which is again when our estrogen drops. And so for some women, there's this way of, I guess, trying to support yourself where they call it cycle dosing. So if you are on ADHD medication, sometimes women will need to increase their medication in the luteal phase. Sometimes it's more that they need to decrease it in the, ovulation kind of follicular phases and things. So it's quite a art to work out, which of course is very difficult in perimenopause when the whole thing's very, very unpredictable. Where am I in this cycle? I am still cycling, but it's not, a predictable cycle. So that's really challenging. But I think, so that's the kind of, very neuroendocrine contribution that's made to midlife ADHD, late diagnosis kind of stuff. I think the other thing is, midlife is full of demands, and those demands are both external, families, friends, elderly parents, work, finances, all that kind of stuff. And then it's also the demand of going through perimenopause itself, which brings with it challenges, things that we need to now cope with, the sore joints we didn't used to have, the hot flushes, the shitty sleep, all that kind of stuff. So it brings added demands and at the same time reduces our capacity. And so it's this scenario, it's this kind of perfect storm, speaking of lightning at your place, it's this perfect storm where, we actually aren't able to, we don't have the resources to meet the demands because the demands are higher and the resources are lower. And I mentioned briefly before this concept of masking and compensatory strategies. And what I certainly know is that a whole bunch of things. Firstly, I think life was in some ways easier for kids back when we were kids than it is now.
Yeah.
We had lots of less demands on our attention. We had a lot more space and in our lives, you know. And I think that is one factor in why ADHD wasn't as prevalent back then, because we didn't have a system that required what it requires of kids now. Kids are required to sit for far longer. The content they're being asked to take in at school is huge, like way more dense than the curriculums back when we were kids. And you would know this as a teacher. And then we've also got all this added thing of anyone can reach me because of social media and connectivity and all the rest and all of the stuff that comes with that. But I also think, and I'm thinking of how I was parented and a lot of my friends were parented, parenting was different. So I think I had a lot of scaffolding, and a lot of midlife women that I talked to would kind of say that how they were parented, there was a lot more clarity around boundaries, maybe tighter boundaries, and a clearer hierarchy, parents and children and things. And so I feel as though I developed compensatory strategies, things that helped minimize the impact of my ADHD, just by virtue of having parents who were more methodical in how they lived their lives. Routine was easier to implement. There weren't as many demands on their time as there is on my time as a parent, like a whole bunch of things. So if I was to do, when I did those screeners, and I gave you some of the kind of classic items, losing phones, losing keys, that kind of thing, right? And time, punctuality. My mum was a nurse. My dad was in the army. If you were, 10 minutes early, you were still late. So that's how I was raised. So that wasn't an issue for me. Things had a place in the home. I've carried that through to my adult life. I'm not necessarily tidy, but things have a place. And so I don't lose my keys. I don't lose my phone, because I come home and I put them in the same places that they always go in. I lose my nana if other people don't do that for me with things. And so there's just things that I've implemented. My profession has really toned down the blurting out, the interrupting. And as I said, I can sit still for a long period of time. People fascinate me. Well, I can't sit still. I can sit for a long period of time, but I move, and it's just how I've supported myself to channel the hyperactivity, but still be able to pay attention. It's a bit like kids getting the wobble boards that they can put their feet on under the desk. Like, that's my adult therapist version of it, is I just move a lot in my chair. So we develop these compensatory strategies to kind of try and get through life in an okay way. I've got a million alarms. I've got alarms for alarms. And I was stunned that other people don't need to do that. Like, I thought that's just what you had to do. So there's things, and in fact, somebody once said to me, just pick up someone's phone and have a look at their reminders and their alarms. That's diagnostic in and of itself. So compensatory strategies are something that a lot of women develop, take into midlife, but with the demands of midlife life and then the reduced capacity due to perimenopause, we become less able to implement those and use those compensatory strategies. I didn't really have a problem organising my food shopping for the week and my cooking, what I was going to cook. But at the height of my perimenopause with the ADHD, I suddenly was incapable of making sure I had everything I needed, for the food shop. And so I was always having to kind of run out and get, different things because I'd forgotten. And it's not as simple as creating a list, because then you forget to lose the list, or when you're writing the list, you forget to add those things on. Let alone, where do I start? I'm not a fan of cooking, but I've been doing it for a long time. I can do it, but I'd be like, I just couldn't organize myself. And they weren't things I struggled with before I hit perimenopause. They were things that really, I didn't like them, and they always felt effortful, but I really struggled with them in perimenopause.
Like you were talking about the masking and how that's a lot of girls and women have masked for a long now, for decades for women by the time they get to midlife. That we now know more about how it presents in girls and in females. What do you mentioned before we jumped on that there's no hard stats. Have we got at least beginnings of, maybe not so much now in this stage of a woman's life, but have we got any stats talking about girls and boys? Well, basically, what is a statistic of how many people would be, or children would be, firstly diagnosed with ADHD? And then what differences might there be between girls versus boys?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure there are stats and I've looked at them, but I can't roll them off the top of my tongue. But what I can say is that the diagnosis for boys when we were kids far outstripped girls.
Yeah.
And we actually know that girls were far more likely to be diagnosed with it, and women with anxiety and depression, and boys were likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. I know someone who both her and her, like their kids are neurodivergent, and her husband went to a GP, both believing they're ADHD. And this is a person who's also a psych. So they both went to a GP at different times saying, we think we've got ADHD. She came home with a diagnosis of anxiety and a suggestion for antidepressants. He came home with a referral for ADHD. And I know that's just kind of one example, but that is very, very common. So this is medical misogyny at its best. And, it fits into that hysteria, neurotic, anxious kind of picture that we just tend to get lumped in. Equally so, a lot of men would complain that they're lumped in the ADHD bucket when they're not necessarily ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that. But yeah, the stats are pretty profound for like when we were younger. They're starting to get closer together now.
Okay.
And then, as I said before, anxiety and depression are common comorbidities.
Yes.
For people with ADHD, because life is tricky.
Yeah.
And the efforts that we have to go to, and that's the thing, we can look like we're doing what everyone else is doing and we're coping and we're proper adulting, as I like to call it.
Yeah.
But the effort and the internal, the behind the scenes is huge for a lot of ADHDers in terms of how they meet their responsibilities.
So if we think about then, Kirsten, the sorts of things that if somebody has been diagnosed with ADHD or they think that they do have it, what sort of practices, what sort of some of those daily things that you do? You mentioned before about alarms is something that you've got there to remind you. What other sorts of things are really helpful for people who do have ADHD?
I think it really depends how it plays out, because interestingly, having a lot of ADHD friends and a handful who are also psychs at the same time, I know that some of my friends I look at, I'm like, man, the perfectionism in like how they do things to the nth degree, and they're uber organized, and that's the effort that they put in to make sure they deliver, and hugely effortful. Whereas there's parts of my life where I would say, oh, well, I'm not very organized. It can show up as perfectionism. It can also show up as giving up. And it might look a little bit like that for me in some of the domains of my life. I've just, I guess, made conscious decisions about what's important to me to try and kind of work on and what's not. And I also want to be really clear that, we do still need to understand. There's a phrase called neuroaffirming, and, it's often used in terms of professionals working with neurodivergent people, is to make sure that they have a neuroaffirming approach, which is it's difference, not disorder. And how can we support you with accommodations, not compensatory strategies, because compensatory strategies actually require a lot of behind the scenes effort to look normal. Accommodations are, we're going to help you as much as we can not be so disadvantaged by your challenges. We're going to make some changes in your environment or the expectations that match your capacity and your strengths and things. Masking is usually again, not helpful because it's driven by I want to fit in and I can't be fully myself. And so it's a shame-based kind of often behaviour. But accommodations is a healthy way of looking at it. And so, I I live and breathe as much as I can a neuroaffirming approach in my life with myself and my kids. And how that plays out is I make decisions on what's really important to me to get right, or where it's really important for me to fit into what the expectations are. So I definitely used to beat myself up during this, this phase of stage of life, because I just couldn't organize myself. I mean, my boys go to their dads and stuff, same routine forever. And without fail, they'd come home on a Wednesday, and Wednesday night I'd be like, oh my God, I've actually forgotten to get the stuff they need for school the next day. And I just made the decision that I would, find ways. So there's food that I've cooked and frozen, so that when I invariably forget, it's there. I've given them probably more money to buy them lunch than I would than I would actually like to. But the stress and the effort that's required to always make sure I've got this stuff happening, is just not worth it for me. So I give myself permission to cut the corners, I guess. If we're going to have eggs on toast for dinner sometimes, my kids aren't little, by the way, so they also could cook for themselves. But, I'm a lot more flexible in how I approach that. I laugh when I wash my clothes for the fourth time because I've forgotten to hang it out the prior three. And just kind of like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So it sounds like you've come to peace. It sounds like you've come to peace with the fact that, this is who you are.
Yeah. Yeah. And even with clients, I have learned that I've learned to actually say, look, if you're someone who really needs a punctual therapist, like super punctual, I can't do that. And so I'm equally flexible, because I have a lot of ADHD and midlife women on my books that, I'm 5-10 minutes late, they're 5-10 minutes late, I'm 5-10 minutes late, which also means that I then give them 5 or 10 minutes more, which then makes me late for the next, and I have no doubt it really frustrates some of them, but I do really try. I do really, really try. But I just know some of my limitations. And there are some people who I've said that to, and they're like, yep, that will really drive me insane. And I'm like, let's just not go any further. I'm not hugely late. You wait way longer for a doctor than you ever would for me. But just stuff like that as well, I think, is really important. So I've implemented different things in my working life. Like, technology is a curse at times, but now we've got technology as health professionals where it transcribes sessions for you, and you set up templates and it turns it into case notes. That has been a godsend. I've told so many people about it, and, I'm like, just do the same, use it for meetings as well. It doesn't just apply for psychology therapy sessions. Use these platforms so that if you're trying to take notes during a meeting, which is both distracting, and then you've got to write them up nicely afterwards or whatever, and that just takes you ages. I've implemented those kinds of things. I have to use alarms for things that aren't routine. So my bins go out every Wednesday night. I don't need an alarm for that because it's every Wednesday night. Although I do have to say which coloured bin goes out, and that's in my calendar. So I've set that up until Armageddon. Yep. What bins go out on Wednesday night. But I do need to put multiple reminders in my phone for things that aren't routine. The orthodontist I've got to take my son to, or the doctor's appointment that I've got. I also book everything in with about half an hour extra. So sometimes I say to people, if I'm sending a calendar invite, as an example, let's just say something starts at 11:30, I will block out from 10:30 and I'll say, Joe and Kirsten, 11 a.m. start, even though the 10:30 time is what I've said the meeting starts from. And I will let the person know, I know it starts at 11, I'm blocked, because they'll get the invitation from 10:30. Yeah. So, I let that, and I allow half an hour on the other side. I have to do stuff like that, because one thing I forget is sometimes I'm moving between locations and I need time, to be able to get to places or whatever, or I just need to have a moment because I do go over time. I need to have a bit of a buffer. And I'll have reminders for those kinds of things. So definitely I don't tend to forget my medication because I tend to get up at the same time every morning, but I certainly know that some people do. And so then we talk about habit stacking, which I know that you know all about as well. And, different medications take different amounts of time to kind of kick in. So I will have conversations for those on medications, and we'll be trying to work out, when does your medication kick in? Like, how long does it take? And so then we'll try and time it that they're taking it, early enough that it kicks in when they need it to. And then we look at, well, how do we habit stack that?
Yeah.
And things. So, there's lots of different strategies. I tend to get women, though, who come to me and they really want to be neurotypical. They say, I'm going to get a diary. And I'm like, oh, I can almost guarantee that's not good. How many diaries have you had and you've never used? And so the neuroaffirming approach is really about recognizing what is feasible and doable. Because if I give strategies, one of the things that always annoyed me as my kids were going through, particularly high school, is when they talk about study skills. There is no point telling an ADHDer to study in small chunks, which I know is a fantastic concept to, kind of learn this and do it, in bits and pieces, and rather than all at the last minute. But there is no point. It's not going to happen. I've tried it, and that was one of the things that I knew about myself a long time ago. I didn't know why I could cram everything in at the last minute and do really well. But if I tried to spread it out, I could have a plan. I could not think. I could not pay attention to that 2 weeks before it was due. I could not organize my thoughts. They would not crystallize at all.
That's sounding familiar for me, actually.
Yeah. It sounds familiar for a lot of people. And I've done a lot of writing in my career, particularly psych reports and things. And I just would try and do it in chunks because that's a sensible thing. It stops that urgency, it stops the late night, all of those bits and pieces. I gave up after a while because I knew I always delivered. But it would actually waste more time me trying to do it in the neurotypical way than when I just said, no, I'm going to do it the way I need to do it, which is what some people might call last minute. Yeah. And I organize as much as I can my life around that. So it's like, okay, if this is due then how can I clear my schedule in the immediate lead up to that, the days before that? Yeah. And it just comes to me then. It falls out of my head. It doesn't if I try it the other way.
Kirsten, can I just ask you a question? Because you mentioned medication. And again, because I don't have the working knowledge that you do, I've got, just a thimbleful. Is every person who is identified with ADHD, are they on medication? Is it suggested? No. Or is it like a sliding scale? Medication will help some, medication won't help others.
Well, medication will help about 80% of ADHD. That's what the research will show. But there's plenty of people who opt not to have that. Yeah. And it reminds me a bit of the tortured artist in some ways. So a lot of creative people might experience depression, but if they take antidepressants, they lose their connection to their creativity, And it's a bit the same. Like, there's amazing things about ADHD. It is extremely creative. You have a great capacity for problem solving. You're bloody excellent in a crisis, and you think outside the box. You're often very intuitive and perceptive. You can bring abstract, lots of seemingly unrelated concepts together. You just mind works in a way to bring them all together to make a coherent kind of thing at the end of it. Like, there are a heck of a lot of talents. You can be a gazillion times more productive when you're in that urgent interest mode than, the neurotypical. Yeah, who's chugging away. So you can get a heck of a lot more work done when you're in that space. And if you're interested in something, you will know a lot about it because you've gone down rabbit holes and things. So there are a heck of a lot of talents. And, I guess one of the things I said I'd come back to is that I guess there's a lot of research that shows that ADHDers can have difficulties in education, employment. They, have high rates of substance use, high rates of other mental health conditions. They can have challenges in relationships, prison. It's a pretty grim picture, right? And yet then I meet, and we do know that there's all these quite capable women in particular, and men, but I'm going to talk about women who are ADHDs. And it's like, well, how does that happen? How does that happen? And a lot of it, okay, we cannot ignore the family environment, the social environment, and the privilege and the opportunity and all of that kind of stuff is absolutely critical. We cannot ignore it. But often the other factor as well is I'm not sure if you've heard of the concept of twice exceptional.
Yes, I have. As it relates to giftedness, that's how because I used to be in the gifted ed.
Yeah. Okay. So my understanding, because it wasn't my area of expertise, and I still wouldn't say giftedness is, but my understanding, again, if we go back to when we were kids and teenagers, giftedness had a really narrow definition. And it was basically the WISC that measured giftedness. And if you got a certain score, then you were gifted and stuff like that. What we actually know is giftedness is far broader than that. And we're now including intuition, creativity, problem solving, like a whole bunch of other talents. And what they're really finding is that, I guess, ADHDers who are successful by their definition, perhaps, they're likely to have two other talents, gifts. They're going to have giftedness in two other areas. And it can be IQ, can be that very typical IQ kind of measure, but it can be in these other areas of giftedness as well. So as the term of giftedness has expanded, then we've been able to make sense of, okay, well, this is how we get to that kind of particular point. So I would say successful women, firstly, are super hard workers. There's a lot going behind the scenes, both in terms of just being able to meet the demands of adult life, but also to be able to succeed in, professionally or whatever they're doing, as well as they've got talents in other areas that they may be very dismissive of. And that's because, academia seems to be kind of what we value. So, okay, but if you're not brilliant at physics as well as successful in whatever career, then a lot of people are like, well, no, I'm not particularly talented or gifted, but we do have these other areas of giftedness, and they help compensate for the challenges that we have, particularly in our working memory and attentional kind of challenges and stuff like that. There's a fair amount of information about twice exceptional. And I know when I've shared it with a few people, it's absolutely hit home for them. But at the same, like as in, I get it now, how I've managed to achieve this stuff. Often it's met with tears though. And I think generally a late diagnosis is quite a big experience because it explains a lot. And so there can be a lot of relief. Suddenly it's like, I'm not broken. Suddenly I'm not lazy. I'm just not a messy person. All these things that we tell ourselves. A lot of women can get the too much. You're too much because they I heard that all my life. The enthusiasm is really high, the chattiness, the feelings can be quite big. You tend to be quite expressive, even in the language you choose. So girls can often get too much as a statement. So a diagnosis can really kind of actually unload a lot of baggage. But at the same time, so that brings relief. It brings a lot of sadness. They've carried it that long. It's like, oh, it's just my brain is different, And then it can bring a lot of anger because there's a lot of anger about the lack of support, the lack of understanding, and the challenges that they've experienced. So what I find interesting is you rework, you then are left looking and you understand yourself differently. It's a process then of learning, how does my ADHD, how do I experience it as an individual? How do I express it? And now I've got that to make sense of myself with. And that's happening at the same time that perimenopause is prompting us to do that as well, because we're also reflecting on who we are and how we want to live and
that's
all of that
transitions
stuff
that happen. The peri is just one. This could be another. On all those other things. So I can understand.
It's pretty profound. And so for me, as I said, it took a year for me to kind of take my diagnosis on board. And part of that, the reason I was able to is because I did work with a psych, because when you are who you are, it can, it's quite, I mean, I've spent many decades knowing that people think differently to me and are different to me and have had different life experiences and things, but I hadn't necessarily translated it through this lens. And so for me, it was really mind-blowing to realize that, as I said, like, people didn't need the 50 million alarms that I need, or sometimes I knew it and I just thought they were had a particularly good memory and I had a particularly shit one. So it just, I really had to understand how it played out. And part of that was understanding the gifts that ADHD brings for me. I credit my entire career, which I feel so fortunate to have had, on my ADHD, without a doubt. I can see it for sure. And so, it's quite a profound experience, and that's where I spend a lot of time with women when they've just had a diagnosis. It's like, hey, what does this mean for you? How does you experience it?
So just in wrapping up then, Kirsten, if somebody who's listening thinks, well, I may have it, what's the pathway that people usually go through for a formal diagnosis? Do you go GP first, then psych, or psych first?
So there's a couple of options, how I approach it when people ask me this question is, I say to them, if you find out you're an ADHDer, will you be considering medication? That's the first question I ask, because if they are, they will have to see a psychiatrist at some point. That's just kind of how it is. So if that's a yes, what I will say to them, great, go to your GP, get a referral, because lots of psychiatrists have their books closed and they might only open them in the January, which means you've got to they'll literally receive a referral and chuck it until their little window where they'll open the books. Or at the best, you'll have a 6-9 month wait. So get cracking, because it's not a quick thing for you to do. Now, for those who either don't want medication, aren't sure they'll do medication, or who can't wait that long, I would then certainly say a psych who's trained in ADHD assessments, particularly I think late diagnosis, midlife, will be able to assess and diagnose. We just can't prescribe. And I did a webinar through WellFem with a psychiatrist on Tuesday night about ADHD and perimenopause, and Dave, the psychiatrist, and I talked about the psychiatrist assessment and the psychologist assessment. There's a lot of similarities between the questions we ask. There's some extra tools that psychologists use because we're only licensed to use them. But overall, there's a lot of similarities. I think one of the differences is, and Dave is the most beautiful man and psychiatrist, I think one of the differences is that we may end up spending more time educating and also helping people find their unique experience and expression of ADHD. So an assessment process often is the beginning of a therapeutic journey in some ways, of understanding themselves better. Yes, we're trying to extract information from them to be able to see if they meet a diagnosis, but there is more of a giving back as well, of education and observations and what this might mean for them. If you see a psych, you don't need a referral. You can't have an assessment under a mental health care plan. You can have treatment under a mental health care plan. Some private health funds, if you're covered for psych consultation, will cover a part of the assessment process for psychologists. Obviously, if you're getting a referral from a GP to a psychiatrist, you'll get a Medicare rebate for that. And, as I said, so there's options. There's options, basically. The issue is that it's expensive. That's the trouble. Both those processes are really expensive. Once you're on medication, it can take a while to find the right one. So you're trialing it, going back to your psychiatrist and things, and tweaking and all the rest. Hopefully you're someone who manages to get the right type, right dose sooner rather than later, but it can take a heck of a lot longer. And particularly so if you're going through this process during perimenopause, because of the intersection of the hormones and that they're not stable. So it can take a little bit longer to kind of get that combo. There's a little bit of there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that during perimenopause, the combination of hormones and ADHD medication is better together than alone, each one alone.
Right.
And I certainly found that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all of the information today. That was a masterclass in itself, because you've given us the clinical understandings and what it looks like, how it presents, and also your personal insights into how it's affected you. So thank you for sharing that, because that's important. Personal, that's a lovely combination that we can share together on the podcast. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
And I look forward to catching up at some other stage too, because I'm sure there'll be something else we can talk about in the future. There's no doubt. Thanks again for your time, Kirsten.
You're welcome. Thanks, Jo.
Thanks so much for listening and sharing your time with me today. I'd love you to hit subscribe on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app to keep spreading these empowering messages. Please share this podcast with other incredible midlife women in your world. Join me again next week for another redefining midlife conversation. Thanks again for tuning in.